Hey everybody, welcome to the first lecture for Paladins University. In this lecture we're going to be talking about space. And space is one of the most, probably the most important thing to understand for competitive Paladins, because literally everything that happens in the game involves space. Space changing, space opening. If you're making a play, something is being affected in space, so getting a good understanding of it is really essential. It's really essential to have a fundamental understanding if you want to play the game at a top level. Now, the first thing to talk about with space is just very generally, what is space? And really, space is just space. That's all there is to it. It's any playable area on the map, right? This is space, 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 everything is space. And usually when people talk about space, though, they're talking about like making space, or what space is open, or what space can you go to, things like that. And so I want to separate it into two terms, essentially: a contested space and open space. Are the two things that I'm going to be talking about. So contested space means space that somebody is essentially exerting their control over, space that you cannot really walk into freely without getting shot or stunned or whatever. Space that like you're going to have to do something to open up. And open space, on the other hand, then, is any space that is not contested, pretty much any space that you can walk into freely, and pretty much any space that you can occupy without really having to worry about it too much. So the most important thing when it comes to space is figuring out how space is made. And to do that, we first have to figure out how space is contested. And essentially, space is contested in a champion's effective threat range. So everything in a champion's effective threat range is being contested. An effective threat range pretty much means that anything that champion has to not let the enemy be there comfortably. So main two ones are damage and crowd control. Now, in Paladins, there are 4 different types of champions or classes, and each of them sort of generally contest space a little bit differently, right? So tanks, for example, let's take this Makoa. Tanks contest the space directly around them, usually in sort of like a small to mid-range circle, and they do this with damage and CC, right? So tanks have decent damage up close, but it falls off very quickly, and they generally have some sort of CC that is short range around them. So for Makoa example, for our Makoa here, he's a great example because you can essentially imagine like this circle around him that is his hook range, right? So anything that comes into this circle, he is effectively contesting very well because nothing really wants to get hooked. That's very dangerous, very threatening to them, and so that is the space that he naturally sort of contests. On the other hand, you have things like damage champions, right, that don't really have that sort of CC, but they have a lot of damage, right? So damage champions, the damage class, contest space through their effective damage range, right? So Victor, for example, has a good damage in anything he can see, right? Like he has good close range damage, he has good mid range damage, he has good long range damage. So anything that Victor can see is going to be under threat, right? So Victor can see like all this stuff actually as well, and all of that is going to be Victor's contested space, right? DPS naturally contest quite a lot of space at once, and different types of DPS sort of contest a little bit differently. Like if you take BK here, for example, blasters naturally contest space a little bit shorter range because the farther range you go, the harder it is to hit projectiles, so it's not really consistent damage once you get to a certain range, so they can't really contest super long ranges. Like BK can't really contest the Victor over here because he can only hit bombs consistently, let's say over here, whereas Victor can contest this BK over here because he has long range. However, blasters have the advantage that they can sort of hit around corners fairly consistently, so BK will sort of contest like these areas outside of like this doorway here. Even though his LOS is restricted by this doorway, he still hits outside of it in these areas a little bit. Excuse me. Flanks are very similar to damage in that they contest things in their effective damage range. However, flanks just have generally much shorter range than damage champions. However, they make that up with different sorts of utility and mobility generally. Supports are a little bit weird ones. They contest the space around them similar to everything else in terms of what they can threaten, but obviously supports aren't super threatening. So, for example, like Domba here, he's going to have a very small radius around him of things that he can consistently and effectively damage and stun, right? But it's going to be quite small because Domba's range is quite small, and he can't really consistently hit stuns from a very long distance. And so most supports just have a very small effective threat range around them, which is really inconsistent, right? And another thing about supports is that they're more champion specific and more matchup specific, right? So Domba and Genos can contest the space around them a lot better than something like Ying, right? Because Ying has similar damage to them, but she doesn't have any CC, whereas Domba and Genos have sort of CC that they can also provide to that threat range. And it's also matchup dependent, right? Like if you have a Genos or something, Genos is going to be very dangerous to something like a Tyra at close range, because Tyra really doesn't have any way to get out of the grip. But if it's a Koga, for example, he's not going to be very threatening to a Koga, because Koga has like 17 different ways to get out of his grip. But very, very generally, though, supports don't contest space by themselves very well. Really, their job is to support others in contesting their space. So their healing essentially reinforces others who are contesting space, right? Like a Domba healing a Makoa is going to mean that Makoa's contested space is that much stronger, right? It's going to be that much harder to push him out of that space. So really, they help others hold their ground the best. Now, for all of everyone's contested space depends on the resources they have available to them, although this is the most notable in supports, right? So when you think about Maldamba, for example, Maldamba obviously has this very small range around him, which he contests effectively. However, conditionally, when he has all of his resources, namely his ultimate, he suddenly contests a much, much larger area for a very brief amount of time, right? If Maldamba has ult, suddenly he can contest his BK, he can contest his Makoa, he can contest his Victor, he can contest like pretty much everything on this map very quickly with his ult, because his ult is a very powerful tool at contesting space. Now this is true for everything, depending on what resources they have up, but it's the most notable in supports because obviously without them, they're very weak at contesting space, but with them, typically support ults are very strong, and so they contest them very, very well. Things like Khan as well have a very notable one, right? Khan's range is effectively very short, but when he has ult, it's very long. So let's take an example here of where space is contested versus where it's free, just in general. We're going to move these champions off to the side. Let's say that this red team here has a relatively standard setup. They have like a tank over here. They have a tank over here. I mean, that's not too typical. But a damage here, and a support here, right? That means that the space that they're going to be testing is they'll have a little circle around this tank. They'll have a little circle around this tank. This damage can see like all of this stuff. And this damage can see pretty much everything, even into these windows and stuff here. And so pretty much you can see they're contesting almost the entirety of Ice Mines here. The only thing that blue team has that is really uncontested is like these little areas back here, right, that aren't being actively contested by the red team there. Now, obviously, blue's also going to have their people positioned to contest the red team's spaces, similar to how the red team is contesting theirs, right? So there's always a lot of like space contention going on naturally in games. Okay, so the most important question, or the most important thing about space is understanding how it is made, how it's taken, how space sort of opens up, right? Like this is what you really need to understand. And there's two general ways or general categories of how space is made. There's direct and indirect. And the main difference between the two is how reliably they make that space. So directly taking space will always open up space, whereas indirectly won't necessarily do so. So let's start with directly taking space. So to directly open up space, you have to remove the ability of the thing contesting that space to contest it. So for example, if there's this Victor holding down, let's say he's just holding down stage, he's holding on this lane here, in order to open up this space for your team, you have to get rid of this Victor somehow. You have to somehow stop him from doing damage to this area. So usually, there's two ways to do this, right? Usually you're going to do this by moving your contested space onto where this victor is positioned, onto where the enemy that is contesting the space is positioned. And this has better results than the other ways, but it requires a lot more resources invested, as we'll get into in the next lecture. So, for example, let's say this victor is contesting a stage, right? And you want to open up stage, right? So in order to deal with this, you're going to have to move your Makoa's contested space onto where this victor is positioned to force him out, right? So Makoa's here, his effective threat range, he's contesting only this little area around him, so right now the victor's not under any threat, right? But if you move this Makoa, if Makoa shell spins up here or something and gets up here, now that this victor is in his little circle, he's going to be contested by the Makoa, and since Makoa wins it at short range, right, if he hooks him, Victor's pretty much dead. He has to play very safe and very scared. This victor then is going to want to run away rather than contest his space back somewhere where he's not in Makoa's effective threat range, and therefore no longer will have the LOS on this stage area, which will open it up for Makoa's team here, right? Victor can no longer see this. It's no longer in his effective threat range. He's no longer contesting this, and this space has been made. This space is now open for blue team. The second way to do this, which requires a little bit less resources but is a little bit more like conditional, is to block this victor, block that champion from contesting the space in some way. So the main ways to do this, at least in Paladins, are like shields, barriers, and even body blocking, right? So let's say again that this victor is contesting a stage, everything in his LOS. Here he is contesting. If you take this Makoa and you run him over here, and he puts down his little shield here, suddenly the area that this victor can actively contest is a lot smaller than it was before, right? If the shield's here, this victor's LOS, he can still shoot like over here, but as soon as he gets this barrier, he can no longer shoot past it, right? So he can only shoot there, which means this space behind the Makoa's shield now is open for his team, right? So this is, it only requires like the shield cooldown to use, as much less resources, but as soon as the shield dies, Victor's going to be shooting it again, right? And you can see by body blocking as well, if we move this Makoa right up into the victor's face here, right? Sometimes this happens. The victor can't shoot through the Makoa, right? So there's going to be this little channel behind the Makoa that Victor can't see in that is open space for his team. Right, so that's a way to directly contest the space that isn't quite as aggressive, doesn't require quite as many resources, but is only like conditional. You can only do it for so long. Eventually the shield's going to die or Makoa's going to die, right? But sometimes you also need to just contest space indirectly. So indirectly making space works by manipulating the enemy's attention and suggesting that they contest other space, right? So it's not as reliable, but it sort of suggests that they look at other space, for example. And so this is mostly aimed at like DPS champions, although it does apply to other classes like tanks as well. But let's look at it in terms of opening a space that a DPS is contesting, right? So how this works is it applies pressure to the enemy somewhere else, which is going to turn their attention to that area, making the DPS turn and want to sort of relieve that pressure and help out his team. And so there's two ways that this is done, but they both rely on you contesting space that is important for them to hold. Right, and the first way to do this is to make an aggressive play into some of their important space that they want to hold. Right, so let's say you want to open up this space in main that the victor is contesting, right? Let's say this victor is contesting point here. He's putting a lot of pressure here. You want to open this up, but you don't want to go straight through main and like contest him because that's maybe unwise for some reason, right? Maybe you're just going to get ulted by something up mid and you're just going to die, right? So rather than do that, you can indirectly contest a space by having your ROM over here jump over towards this IO, right? If your ROM goes onto this IO here and starts shooting her, this victor here is suddenly be like, oh, he has to make a choice, right? Either he keeps contesting his space up mid here, or he goes and helps and peels his IO. And like, realistically, if there's a ROM in your eye, the eye's going to be screaming, and Victor's definitely going to want to help him, right? So he's going to turn his attention to over here, right? Which indirectly opens up the space over here, right? So now the space that he was contesting is open. So you've indirectly created space up mid. Now note that this is indirectly creating space, because if this Andro is like, oh nice, some open space, and he wanders over here, and Victor's decides to not peel instead of helping his IO, he can always just turn back here, right? There's nothing stopping him from turning back here and just killing this Andro if he wants to. That's why it's indirect, right? Another way is like sometimes you'll see indirect space being made by like an Andro going on a big flank over here, and rather than like full committing to the IO, he just sort of like pokes him around the corner, so Victor wants to look here but doesn't want to like commit there, and it just puts Victor in a relatively awkward spot, right? The other way to indirectly contest space, though, is through using the sixth man, which is the point, right? So this is an objective-based game, so the point will steadily exert more and more pressure on a team the closer either the payload gets to the end or the point gets to like 99%, right? As you get to 99%, pretty much everyone's attention is going to be on the point, right? Like let's say this blue team is at 99%. That's red. Let's say this blue team is at 99. This Victor on the red team is pretty much only going to be wanting to look at point, right? Like if something gets on his IO here, he's much less willing to go and help them, because if he takes his attention off point, you know, blue team might just win, right? Like pretty much everyone on red team is going to be worried about the point, right? And when everyone's worried about the point, everyone's contesting their space to be in the middle here. Everyone's grouping their contested space on the middle, which means there's going to be a lot of space that opens on like the outsides of the map, right? And you know, this is such an important thing, right? Like there's an entire class in Paladins, the main tank, that is built around like building up this point percentage so you can abuse this indirectly taking space mechanic, right? Main tank's entire goal is just to get point to like 99% so that the sides of the map open and they can like do things, and the other team just has to pay attention to point. That's all they have to do, right? And the last thing about making space is also really important is that when you make space, you are opening up space for your team, but you're also opening up space for the enemy team, right? Space is finite. There's only a certain amount of space that you can contest at the same time. So if we take this Rom here, right? Like Rom is a tank, so his contested space is an area around him. If Rom makes a play onto this IO here, right? He jumps over here. While he was contesting this space before, he is no longer going to be contesting this space anymore, right? Because he's not contesting this space. So as soon as you move, your contested space moves with you. So when you go to make space, you go to make a play, you're no longer going to be contesting the space that you were before, right? So let's say this is like blue team and red team here. This is something that you'll very typically see in games if you watch it from a top-down perspective, is this sort of like yin-yang thing, right? So the blue team is going to make an aggressive play on this side, which will open up space for the red team on this side of the map. So the red team is going to rotate over here rather than be in their pressure, right? So they jump over here and they kite around here, right? So you get this sort of like yin-yang of attention or of rotations, where blue is going to start on this space and occupy this space, and red's going to start in this space and then go to occupy this space. And this is going to be a really important concept when we get into lecture 3, when we go on some applications of space and resources together. This is really important. So space is finite. Okay, so let's recap really quickly, because that was a lot of ways to make space, and it's really important to have a good understanding of it. So there are two ways to make space, direct and indirect. Direct is more consistent, and to directly contest space, you can either put some of your contested space onto an enemy champion that is contesting space that you want, or block their ability to contest that space with something like a shield. Indirectly contesting space is less reliable, and you can indirectly contest space by pulling their attention to somewhere else and taking space there, or by having the objective close to completion, which will naturally pull lots of attention. Okay, so we've talked about how space is made and how space is contested, but I really just wanted to quickly go over a quick distinction between the two of them that's going to help us in later lectures a little bit, and that's with their resource use. So contesting space is just the space in your effective threat range, right? You're always contesting that space around you just naturally as you move around the map, right? So this Makoa is contesting this space around him, and if he were to move like over here, he's still going to be contesting this space around him over here, right? No longer over here, but over here. However, like this doesn't require any resources. However, it does require that you have them available, right? Like Makoa's threat range is a lot less when he doesn't have hook, right? Like if he has hook, everything in his hook range is threatened, but if he doesn't have hook, then it's just his damage, and some things aren't really as threatened by his damage, right? Making space, on the other hand, like if he wants to go make this space available on stage where the victor is contesting it, he's gonna have to use some resources to do that. Like 99% of the time, you're gonna have to use some resources, right? Like he has to close this distance from here to Victor, right? Like he has to get here somewhere to get Victor in his range, right? So either going to be like a shell spin, or he's going to have to eat Victor damage because Victor's actively contesting this space. He's going to eat some damage and use some health, or put down a shield or something. It's going to require resources for him to make the space there. Now, before we move on to some really important stuff like how to actually effectively take space, it's important that we first realize that all space is not equal. Like, it's not all as important as each other. And I think this is a fairly basic and intuitive concept, so I'm not going to spend too long on it. But just for example, like, obviously, if you have a point fight here, right, like, the point is super important. So this area over here is like quite important because you can like shoot the point and stuff, but area over here is like not as important, right? Like you don't really care about this space over here, whether it's open or contested during the point fight, because it frankly doesn't really matter that much, right? And so the ultimate important space in a point fight or in a payload is the payload or the point, right? It's an objective based game. Like this is always going to be the very most important space in a point fight, right? But generally you don't want to occupy this space, even though it's so important. Pretty much only the main tank ever wants to be here because it's going to be under such heavy fire. Often the point isn't very safe. You can see on Serpent, like there's just a bunch of high grounds around it. You have no cover. You're going to die there if you're not a main tank, right? So then any space that allows you to have this really important space in your contested threat range, in your contested space or your effective threat range, is going to be pretty important, right? It's going to be a priority space. It's going to be space that you want to control. So I typically think about this as almost like a tier list almost, right? So you have like your priority 1 space is going to be like up here, right? This is the most important space for you to control because it allows you to effectively contest point because it's going to be in your effective DPS's range. It's relatively safe from enemies, right? Like they can't get to it super easily. There's this big annoying area in between here or like in between here that they can't really cross very easily. So it's going to be relatively safe and allows you to hit point, right? That's like the ideal space where you can affect point very safely. Priority 2 space then is going to be space where you can relatively safely affect priority 1 space, or you can contest point but not quite as well as priority 1, right? So priority 2 space might be something like all the way back here or something. You can sort of contest point from here but not really as well as priority 1, or space that can contest priority 1 space, right? So for the enemy, like this space is also going to be pretty important. Like it's going to be a priority 2 space because it has this nice LOS up to your priority 1 space here, and you don't really want to let them have that space. Like it's kind of annoying for these people up in this priority 1 space if there's people in this priority 2 space shooting them. It's an angle that they don't really want to deal with, right? Another one would be like this high ground behind you here. If they have control of this space, it's also super annoying for your priority 1 space because the people up here are just going to be shot in the back by whoever's up here. Again, very annoying. It's important space, but not quite as important because it can't directly affect point as easily. And then priority 3 space then would be any space that affects priority 2 space and so on and so forth. Okay, so clearly just knowing about how space is made and how space is contested isn't really enough, right? Like you really want to know how can you actually effectively make space, right? That's like the most important thing in the game. And there's 2 really important things to think about, right? Like one, very basically, like we just talked about, is that space actually important, right? So this space over here, right, is going to be really important because it's going to affect point really easily. But if you want to make some space like over here, like sure, it might be easy to do, but it's not going to be helpful, right? Like no one really cares about that space over there, right? But the second and probably more salient thing to think about is how strongly that space is being contested. Right, so we talked a little bit earlier about how the different roles and like classes contest space differently, but they also have different strengths through which they contest space, right? Like you might think that DPS are the best at contesting space because they can contest the most at once, right? Like this Canessa can contest everything over here, everything over here, everything over here. Like she has a ton of space that she's contesting at once, whereas measly little Makoa over here only has a small little area around him, right? So you may think that DPS contests better, but it's a really important feature of Paladins or component that tanks in flanks, which have a smaller range like this Makoa, contest that space more strongly than the DPS do, right? So let's say that this Makoa goes and makes a play onto this Canessa, right? So now this Canessa is in his contested space, but at the same time, obviously Makoa is also in this Canessa's contested space, right? Like she can shoot the Makoa, right? However, it's really important in Paladins that the Makoa wins this, right? If Makoa can win this, there's be no point in having tanks because, you know, why would you when you can just contest more space at DPS, right? So the fact that Makoa can win this is super important. And same thing with flanks, right? Flanks have shorter range, but once they get close up, they'll win this fight, right? Like Makoa will always beat Canessa in a 1v1 really close range. So the general principle here, although it does have many sort of different cases, is that the smaller a champion's effective threat range is, barring supports, the stronger they will contest that. So obviously there's tons of examples where that isn't necessarily the case, like Ashe, for example, sometimes struggles against some DPS sometimes because she has, you know, low damage output and stuff like that, but as a general rule, that's how Paladins works. So why is this so important to know when thinking about effectively taking space? And it's really important because your matchup knowledge in terms of like space congestion battles, if you want to call it that, is really important. Because remember, if you want to make space, you're going to have to move their contested space. And to move their contested space, you're probably going to need some sort of good contestion matchup, right? Either by outranging their space, like being effectively out of their contested space, or by having, you know, one champion or multiple champions that match up into their space well. So remember, healers are really important for this, right? So if Makoa comes and tries to contest this Canessa, even if he gets to this position, if the red team has this healer just pocketing this Canessa, suddenly this completely flips the matchup, right? If they have their support sort of supporting this Canessa's contested space, suddenly the Makoa loses this and the Canessa no longer has to move, right? So it's going to be really important to think about, you know, where you're pushing into and what the space congestion battle is going to be like. Right, so for example, there's generally like 3 ways in which you can make space effectively, right? The first one, and the one that you always want to look to first, is outranging their effective space, right? So let's say that the enemy team has a Tyra here, right? And she's contesting point, and you don't want her being contesting point, right? She's not letting you do anything on point. So the easiest way or the most effective way to create this space on point is to find something that outranges the Tyra essentially and put the Tyra in their contested space, right? So if you take your Canessa and you plop her down main here, make her rotate main, Canessa's effective range is much longer than the Tyra's, right? She can effectively reach all the way to back here, whereas Tyra can only reach like out here, right? So now you can see this Tyra is in Canessa's threat range, in Canessa's contested space, whereas the Canessa is not in the Tyra's, right? That means Tyra is just going to die. Even if she has the support of the eye or something, it doesn't matter because Canessa is not being contested, right? So the Tyra is either going to die or have to move, and once she moves or dies, this space that she was contesting, she's no longer contesting and gets opened up for the blue team, right? A really obvious example, another obvious example of this is if you have like Makoa contesting point here, he's going to be contesting this point around him in a small circle, and the most standard way to get him off point, to make him not contest that space anymore, is just to get a DPS, have them sit outside of that Makoa's effective range, outside of his hook range, and just shoot him, right? Because Makoa This Tyra is not in Makoa's effective threat range, so she's safe, and she can just push him off a point like that. Makoa has to leave once his cooldowns are up. However, this sort of way to contest space, while it is the most effective, very rarely actually happens in a game. Like, really, this only really happens to like main tanks who like know that they're going to get pushed off. They just use their cooldowns to get some point cap and then get back off, right? Like, in most situations, if a team is positioned correctly, you shouldn't really get many of these situations. Okay, so if that situation isn't going to come up too often, then what's the next best option? Like, how do you make space effectively then? And the next best option, is to just take the space more aggressively, essentially. Use more resources, get in there, overlap your contested space with their contested space, right? And the best, like the classic role for this is like the off tank, right? So the off tank classically just diving into the victor and putting his contested space on top of the victor, right? Like, that's how standardly how this is going to happen, right? And this sort of relies really heavily on the space congestion matchups that I was talking about earlier, right? And resource use as well a little bit. And this gets like really complicated and more complicated the more champions that are involved in influencing that contested space, and you know, what resources are being put into that space. It gets really complicated really fast, and these sort of matchups get really niche, right? But generally speaking, to make this space, you want to make sure that you're contesting that contested space more strongly than they're contesting it, right? And there's generally two ways to reinforce that space, right? So let's say that this Koa is diving onto the victor, right? Like we just talked about, in terms of space congestion battles, the Makoa will win this because he's a tank and Victor's a DPS. Makoa has a very short range, which means he's generally stronger. Essentially, if Victor gets hooked, he dies, right? So Victor won't be able to contest stage anymore. However, the red team here, Victor's team, doesn't want to let that happen, so they're going to reinforce Victor's space with a support, right? Like, this is the primary role of supports, is that they reinforce their teammates' space through like the healing and other support stuff that they do, right? So this IO is gonna, you know, give that juice to the victor, and suddenly now the Makoa is on the back foot and he no longer wins this space congestion battle because they both have the victor and the IO reinforcing that victor space, right? So this brings us to the second way that you can essentially make the contested space stronger, and that is just very simply to overlap your contested spaces, right? So Makoa is contesting this space that they want to contest, which is like this victor's positioning here, and now they're going to rotate Kinessa over, right? So now both Makoa and Kinessa are contesting this space together, right? You can see their space that they're contesting overlaps onto this victor here where he wants to be. So now, even though Victor has like the IO pocket, and even though they're reinforcing that, the blue team is reinforcing it even harder because they have multiple champions contesting that space at the same time. So it's going to force this victor backwards, right? Like, this is very classically what happens when an offlane pushes another offlane, right? Like, the offlane, let's say it's Makoa and Kinessa, they're going to push together, overlapping their spaces and just steamrolling anything that tries to contest those spaces as they contest them together, right? So to make space more aggressively, you're going to remove the victor's ability to contest that space by putting his position in your contested space, right? And as much of your contested space as you can possibly afford to put there, you want to put there, right? So both the Makoas and the Kinessas. And you do this through overlapping the space like we just talked about, or through healers sort of reinforcing that space. Now, sometimes doing it this aggressively isn't actually that smart. Sometimes the enemies are going to be set up in a way that isn't going to let you just aggressively take that space like that, right? Especially versus comps that are sort of set up to be passive and react around aggression, right? They're set up to react, to be able to put their contested space in whatever area it's sort of needed to be. And in these situations, it's a lot smarter to indirectly take that space instead of directly take that space. So remember, indirectly taking space is taking space sort of somewhere else, taking something else important to them so that it moves their attention, and it is less reliable, right? So you only really want to do this when you can't, or it isn't smart to just directly brute force take that space away from them. And so one of the really classic examples of this is when they have a passive sort of point cap burning composition, right? So they're usually set up around some sort of point, which I'd like to call like the point of balance for the comp, right? So if we take this red comp here, Anar, Anger, Ash, Maldamba, and Victor, their point of balance is like right back here where their Victor is free firing a point, right? It kind of relies on the Victor and the Inara. Victor burning point for free over here, and the Inara being able to cap point and then just very safely back into this area whenever she's out of cooldowns. Right, so this is sort of their point of balance, and everything else on their team, pretty much everything you can see, everything is either contesting this space already or can very easily contest this space if something happens to it, right? The Andrew is right there to shoot at the Ash, can very easily dash over and do whatever she wants, right? So now remember, space is finite, right? So with these comps, while they have their point of balance in the middle here, they're very, very heavily contesting here. The spaces on the outside, they're not really going to be contesting quite as well, right? And you can see this very basically just with like their main area contestion champion is the Victor, right? And he can only really see point when he's set up here, right? Like he can't really see this, he can't really watch this and point at the same time, and he can't really see like the garden area from there. Right, so the areas on the outside are always going to be a little bit open, which means that they're much easier for your team to take. So often what happens with like the team that needs to be aggressive is like, let's say they have a double off tank, for example, right? So they're going to try to indirectly open up some space in the middle by doing a play on the outside, right? So let's say, for example, that this Rom, he's going to dash into, maybe with some support or something, he's going to dash into the left side here, right? And he's going to try to take space in this room. He's going to put his contested space into this room, for example, right? And now the red team has two options, right? They can either just back off and give the space, be like, okay, Rom, we don't really want to fight you for this. We're just going to back off and we're all going to go main and really reinforce this space here, right? But they really don't want to do that because now the blue team controls like tons of space on the map, right? And that's just generally not good for the red team. So rather, what this is going to most likely do is it's going to pull some of their attention that was in the middle over to this aggressive play that's happening on the left side, right? Because they really don't want to give this up. It's not their main priority space, but they really don't want to give this up either, right? So they're going to be looking more over here, right? And as we discussed earlier, this indirectly opens the space up middle for something else to happen, right? It creates an opportunity for the blue team to do something in the middle that wasn't there before. Right now, as soon as Rom dashes in, you'll often see those double off-tank teams. One off-tank makes a play on the side, and then the other one just comes right through mid, right into the underbelly of the other team, maybe with the EV as well. So let's make these blue, make it a little more clear. They're going to jump through the middle while this Rom is making the space up middle, right? Like Rom is indirectly making the space up middle. The rest of the team is going to jump right into that point of balance for the other team and put their contested space right on top of this Maldamba and the Victor, the point of balance. And since it's an EV and a Ruckus, two things with very, very strong close range contention versus long range contention, they're going to win that, and the Victor's going to die or have to run away or whatever, right? So pretty much because this blue team couldn't directly just take the space up mid, like it would have been very unwise for them to try to just walk up mid like they did there if there wasn't if this wasn't indirectly being contested. So they indirectly contest it by sending someone somewhere else into some other relatively important space for this red team, which opens up the space mid for the Ruckus and EV to use. So to summarize really quickly, because how to effectively take space is just so important, and we went over a couple ways. The most effective way is just to outrange their space, right? If possible, you just want to outrange it. However, this is not really going to come up too often because if teams are positioned correctly, it just won't really happen. So then you're going to want to sort of brute force it, do it more aggressively, take your contested space and put it onto that contested space, put a lot of resources into there, or overlap your space to reinforce it. have a support it to reinforce that space, make it strongerly reinforced than they're reinforcing it to open it up for you. And if that's really not smart, if they're set up sort of like this and they have like a point of balance which they're all ready to contest, then you want to take some space on the other side of the map into some other important area for them that's not quite as important, which will indirectly open up space somewhere else. Okay, so we've spent quite some time now talking about space, and you might be wondering, like, why is space so important in the first place, right? And the very most basic answer to that is that for anything to actually happen in the game, space is going to be involved. Space has to be taken, has to be made for one team, right? Like, if you just take a very basic, like, game, the blue team's going to come out and they're going to occupy their half of the map, and the red team's going to come up and they're going to occupy their half of the map. And if it just stays in this neutral game and nothing else happens, if they just peacefully sort of shoot each other, no one gets picked, tanks do tank things, DPS do DPS things, healer does healer things, nothing's really going to happen. One team is just slowly going to gain a point cap lead, right? If the neutral game, one team just, even if it's just like 1 or 2% ahead, they're slowly going to gain more and more of a lead, right? And what that's going to do is it's going to force the other team's hand. They're going to have to eventually do something, right? And to do anything, that means invading the other team's space, right? It's trying to take a little bit more, getting a little bit more aggressive, moving their contested space somewhere into the enemy's territory, right? So literally any play that happens is going to involve space changing hands, right? One team is always going to be better positioned, so the other team's always going to have to do something. They're always going to have to manipulate space somehow. Now, there's also sort of like more distinct advantages that space gives you, and one good example of these is like angles are super important in Paladins and, well, in any shooter, to be honest. And it's just better to have more angles, and the more space you have, the more angles you'll have, right? So let's look at an example here. Let's say Anara wants to cap point here, right? And one of Anara's really key defensive cooldowns is her wall. Right? You can think of it like a shield for other tanks as well, right? So let's say that this red team only has like this space controlled, right? Like they're only controlling this space in the map. That means if Anara wants to use her wall defensively, all she has to do is like put her wall over here, and neither the Tyra shooting from like the doorway here, nor the Victor shooting from window can damage her anymore, right? This wall is going to block all of it, and she's going to be safe, right? Now let's give red team a little bit more space. Let's move the Tyra over here. All of a sudden, this Anara can't really wall both of them off super comfortably. Like, she can try, but there's always going to be a little bit of space in between her wall, either for the Victor to shoot her here, or if she angles it more this way, for the Tyra to shoot her here, right? And she can maybe, if she backs off a little bit, maybe get a wall that backs that blocks both of them. But if you give red team even more space, what if they control all of this space, right? If they control all of this space and they have another person over here, then suddenly there's absolutely no way that Anara can ever be safe on the point, because no matter which way she walls, there'll always be somebody free firing on her, right? Anara can no longer be safe depending on angles, right? And that's another really important thing. Leads us sort of to another important thing, which is just like general safety. The more space you have, the more safe you are, right? So let's say that this red team has been pushed into a corner here, and this is the only space they really control. That means their LOS is like very limited. It's only really around point here, and let's say maybe the Victor is watching dock, so it's like around here as well, right? But that provides so much free space for like this Tyra or any like supports to be free. Like, they have all of this space. They can walk around freely. They don't really have to worry about it too much. Again, this is super important for like supports. They can heal multiple people, but even this Tyra is like, she can shoot point from this way, and if something happens over here, maybe there's a shield over here, she can just walk over here, no care in the world, because she has all the space in the world. She doesn't really have to worry about getting shot by the Victor or the Kinessa, because they only really have one angle that she has to worry about, right? If the Kinessa is over here and the Victor's over here, suddenly she can't really go over here because the Kinessa will just shoot her if she goes, if she goes there. And so the Kinessa will shoot her, and she has to, move back over here to get out of that Kinessa LOS. And the last thing that's really important to know, like why space is so important is just generally in positions, right? Like positioning is made based off of space, right? Like a good position is good because it means like the space the space that you're contesting is like really important for the enemy, or you're not in any of their contested space. That makes it a good position. Or let's say like a position may be bad because you're in their contested space while not really doing anything important, things like that. And also like there's more specific positioning that's really important for space, right? Like if you're on Bright Marsh here and let's say you're playing a sniper, really the only like a good place for you to play in, the space that you're most effective in is like this window here, right? Like you really want to just like sit back here and shoot point, and then you can sort of rotate a little bit over here as well and get this LOS when possible, right? So if this blue team goes and occupies this space, makes their entire mission, suddenly you don't really have anywhere good to play with this sniper, right? This is sometimes true for like blasters around corners as well. If their corner gets taken, sometimes they're like out in the open. But you see how this Canessa, now she doesn't have any good sight lines, and she's going to be a hell of a lot less effective if blue just like takes some space that's important to her, right? So individual positioning can really get affected by what space is available and what space is taken on the map. Okay, so hopefully by now you have a pretty good understanding of space and how it's created, how it's contested, how to effectively make space, and all of that stuff. And you might be wondering, how is this actually supposed to help you? Like what can you actually do with this knowledge? You know, it is very basic, right? So what are some more practical applications that you can take home with you and start using? And pretty much there are a lot. Like pretty much everything with Paladins relies on space, and so no matter what you do, if you start thinking about it in terms of space, I guarantee it'll at least help you a little bit. But I'll give you some examples of stuff that's like really salient to think about in terms of space, and one of them is with Vodding. Now Vodding as a team is like super important thing to do, obviously. But sometimes it's really important to look at a play that happened and reduce it to purely looking at sort of the space, like what space was held, how it changed, and sort of how that affected the fight, right? In every play that is ever made in Paladins is either a team trying to take some of your space or you trying to take some of their space. And so by looking at what space is contested and how the space contested moves as the fight goes on, it can be really insightful to like improving your team play, right? So let me give you an example in terms of like dive comps or having two champions that want to like dive a backline together, right? Because for some reason Paladins players, for the life of me, it's rare to see a team that can execute this well, and I really don't understand why. So let's take this example here. You have your Rom and your Andrew who want to dive a Victor and an Io, and I've created a very basic map here that's literally just a channel, right? So essentially, this Andrew and this Rom win at close range, and this Victor and the Io win at long range. So all the Andrew and the Rom have to do is find some way to close the gap and then get right on top of them, and then they win that fight, right? And so what I see people do most commonly is that they'll do something, their comms will be like, all right, are you ready to dive? And they'll be like, yep, and they're like, ready, okay, go. And then they'll both start running through this channel and trying to dive on top of the Victor and the Io. Now, obviously, this Victor is contesting this entire channel, right? This is all in his contested space, and he contests it very effectively, right? This is Victor we're talking about. It does a ton of damage. We can imagine he even has a little controller here that he's aimbotting with or whatever. Hopefully that's not too controversial to say. Anyways, so if you do this, right, like you can see this Rom and this Andrew are both directly in this Victor's contested space, right? So what's going to happen, this Victor's going to see this Andrew and he's be like, okay, he's going to see the Rom, he's going to see Andrew, he's going to like, all right, Rom's beefy, he has like 75% DR when he's dashing, not going to bother shooting him, but Andrew, he's just sort of floating through the sky, he's going to laser this Andrew. This Andrew is going to either die or have to fall back, And then this Rom is going to get into the enemy team, and he's going to start fighting them. He's going to be shooting the Victor, he's going to be shooting the IO, and they're not going to really care because the IO is just going to be healing through it, and he doesn't really have enough damage by himself, and he's eventually going to die, and then he's going to be crying about his team not having follow-up, how much space he made. Like, look how much space he made, right? When he's here, he's completely taking the Victor and the IO's attention for like 5 seconds, and he's making so much space, and no one's following up, and everyone else on his team sucks, and it's all their fault, right? Well, wrong, obviously, right? Because they dove, and when they were diving, Androxus was in the Victor's contested space, and obviously he can't do that. He's just gonna die, and you know, they're not gonna have a successful play, right? To fix this, all you need to do is make sure that the Andro the Andro is never going in the Victor's contested space until Victor is in his contested space, right? Like, that's the basics of taking space in these sort of like flank matchups, right? Flanks are really good up close, but they can't really get there just walking straight at him, right? Like, you can imagine the situation without the Rom just as easily with the Rom. If the Andro tries to go through here, whether there's a Rom with him or not, he's gonna die. So to fix this, it's really quite simple, right? And we'll talk more about this when we go into resources, but Rom is really good at crossing the space. So you just have the Rom go first, right? And if the Rom goes and gets here, before the Andro peeks this Victor, if the Andro just stays back, then the Victor can't kill the Andro before he goes in, right? So the Rom is just going to dive in. Now Victor's contested space is no longer in this channel because the Rom is in the way, right? So he can only contest this Rom here, which means this Andro can cross the channel for free and go up and help his buddy Rom, and now they're both at close range. Oopsie. They're both at close range, and we'll win this fight, and these two will die, right? Well, more generally what will happen is that these two will get the Rom to half health, and you'll be out of resources by the time the Andro gets here, which is fine. And then, you know, they either have to make a decision: do they finish killing the Rom and just die to the Andro because the Andro will be free, in which case Rom dies for a good cause, or do they switch onto the Andro who has full health and all of his cooldowns up and try to kill him and then kill Rom after, which, you know, neither are good options because this Rom and Andro made their play well. They played well, right? So it's an easy timing fix, but if you don't think about the space and what's being contested, right? If you don't really like reduce this to the space and realize that, you know, Andrew's trying to cross this, if they're trying to cross it at the same time, Andrew's trying to cross this into contested space, right? And Andrew can't do that as a champion. So if you don't reduce it to the space, it's going to be a lot harder to identify why it's not working, right? And just as a pro coaching tip, if you have a situation like this and it's not working, it's typically not like the Andro's fault. It's probably some communication or more team issue, right? You're on a team with someone for a reason. They're good at the game. So it's pretty easy to see when you're making aggressive plays, but it can also be really helpful when you're getting aggressed on, right? So let's flip things for a second, and let's say you're the Victor and the IO. And let's say that the enemy team makes that play. They have the Rom dash in and the Andro dash in, and you die to it. And this keeps happening every mid, and you're like, okay, you go to VODs, you're trying to figure out why it's happening, what you can do to fix it, right? Let's delete this wall here for a second. And imagine you also have a Shaolin here. But he has, like, you know, some wall over here or something. So he can't really, like, see this channel until he moves up here. So obviously, if you think about this in terms of space, you can like sort of incorporate the entirety of your team in contesting space well together, right? So if they make an aggressive play, they dash your Rom into the Victor and the IO, you know that your Victor can no longer contest this space until he deals with the Rom, right? Like, this space in the middle is going to be open for the blue team, so the Andro can go up here. So once you identify that, rather than just like letting it happen and saying, okay, Victor, you have to burn the Rom and then go back to contesting your space, you can just very simply have the Shaolin, or, you know, the other DPS on the other side of the map, sort of cover for the Victor in that time where he is busy killing the ROM, right? So if you have every time the ROM pushes up on the right side, you just have your Shaolin say, okay, let's have our Shaolin push up on the left side. Then as this Andrew is coming in, suddenly this Andrew is now in the Shaolin's contested space, right? Shaolin's effective threat range, and the Shaolin can stop this Andrew from following up. Your Victor can finish off the ROM, then the Shaolin can move back, and the Victor can take, the Victor can go back to contesting the space because the ROM will be dead, right? And again, by looking at it in terms of space, you can sort of identify that, oh, you know, we had contested space, it got opened up by ROM, so we should have some way to keep contesting that space with somebody else once Victor stops being able to do it. And to do that, you can identify sort of like minor positioning things for like the Shaolin to push up so that he can contest that space instead, right? So that's sort of why reducing things to space and looking at it can be so impactful. And then one other really quick thing for VODing is it can also be really helpful for your personal VODs if you're watching your own games. Try to like look at them from the bird's eye view sometimes, because it can be really helpful to look at the space that's happening. For example, one of the most common practices throughout all games in terms of personal VODing is something called death tracking, where you make a note of every death you have and why you died and try to identify patterns, right? And pretty much every time you die in Paladins, it's going to be because you're in something's contested space, right? So if you're unsure of why you died, or even if you're not, you can even just like do death tracking and look at what space is being contested, and then realize, you know, it sort of helps you inform you as to what killed you, right? Because it will be whatever killed you was generally the thing that was contesting that space that you were in, right? So it can help you identify sort of patterns in terms of space. Maybe you're walking into contested space too much of like a certain type, right? Like let's say maybe you're walking into Kness's contested space, or any snipers, any long range DD's contested space too often at like sort of that long range or something. Another important application of thinking about space is in the draft phase. So when I draft, I typically like to visualize the map and think about what space is going to be important to control. Like for example, the priority 1 space that we were going over before in Serpent Beach, right? So since I know that this space is so important in Serpent Beach, this priority 1 space, I want to draft things that play well in this priority space, right? Think about the space that you're going to control, that you really want to control, and pick champions that control it well and do well from that space. And it's also important that, like, so if I draft something like, let's say, I don't know, like a Shaolin to sit in this priority 1 space, now that I already have something in here, I don't want to draft like a Victor as well, right? Because they both want to sit in this priority 1 space, right? So I don't want to stack all of my things in priority 1 space, because then I won't have any of the priority 2 space. That was a really bad P. I won't have any of the priority 2 space, right? So rather than draft this Victor here, I might think about drafting like an Eevee instead, who can control my priority 2 spaces for me, these 2 spaces up here, while my Shaolin and maybe my like support also sit in my priority 1 space, right? So it's really important to think like, what are the super priority spaces and what can I draft that will fit into those spaces well? Thinking about the game in terms of space is also really important when it comes to understanding positioning, right? Like all positioning is made, like I was saying, based on space. The reason some positions are good and bad are because of, you know, what space is priority and what space is being contested, things like that. So for example, this lets you see like why stacking tanks is bad, for example, right? Like if I put my Inara and my Makoa both on point here, both their contested spaces are this small circle around them, right? So they're essentially going to be contesting the exact same space, right? And I generally don't need to contest this space like that hard, right? Like there's no reason for me to have both tanks here, because then I'm just going to be giving lots of space on the side of the map where I could have one tank locking down space there instead, right? But it also lets you to see these situations where it actually may be good to stack tanks, right? Because in most situations it's bad, but there is some that are good, right? For example, if the enemy team, if my point's at 99% here, and the enemy team has all been forced into this one little space on the side here, I might as well just double down on my tanks because they have really strong space contention in a small area. I might as well make both their contested areas be right here so that the enemy can't get through it, right? Like there's very small situations where you want to stack things like DPS and tanks, and it sort of allows you to identify those times where it is good, and it sort of helps you understand why, in general, it isn't good to stack them at all. But you're not really going to think about that or know that unless you think about it in terms of space. Now, as I've mentioned before, and as we've covered a lot of them, there's a ton of different applications of thinking about space in terms of the game and how to like apply it to your play and to your improvement to help you be better at the game. And I just want to end with one that's like very specific and can really help you at like the very top levels of play. If you're the best player in the game, I kind of want to show you how thinking about space can still really help you improve your game. And this is in micro positioning. So in micro positioning, thinking about your space is sort of to think about the space that you're contesting in your positioning and how the enemy will respond to it. So let's go over an example here because it's easiest to explain through an example. So let's say you're playing this Eevee and you have to push into this Victor who's contesting the space. He's sort of holding this corner, contesting this space on this side of the map here, and he's being supported by his IO. Excuse me. So essentially what's going to happen is you're going to have to find some way to like blink into him and pressure him out, maybe kill him, essentially take that position away from him, right? And depending on where you blink, it's going to have different effects on this Victor, right? And this sort of relies on what is often called the threat principle. I like to call it the threat principle, which is essentially things that are threatening to people create unconscious psychological reactions in them that force them or that make them do certain things or react in certain ways. It preys on their autonomous nervous reactions with like the fight or flight system and stuff like that. Anyway, it's not super important, but essentially what this means is that since Eevee's contestation range, the space that she contests effectively is a small area around her, but Victor's is very large. This means that Eevee is going to win close and Vic is going to win long. So essentially, as soon as Eevee closes distance on Victor, his unconscious reaction is going to be to put space in between you, right? So if you blink over here, oh, sorry, let me make this blue. Let's say you blink over here, right? You come in here, you put him in your effective range. This Victor is just naturally going to start moving backwards away from you to try to restore that balance and make the fight a little more evenly, right? If he's back here, suddenly the fight, if he backs off successfully, the fight's a little bit more even. You're both sort of at mid-range where you don't really want to be, right? Victor wants to be a little bit longer, you want to be a little bit shorter, but the fight's more even, he's being supported by IO, right? But the thing is that you can abuse this depending on where you blink, right? So if you know he's going to naturally move away from you, if you blink over here, it puts him in this really awkward position, right? Because his natural reaction is going to be to back up as he shoots you, right? He's gonna be backing up away from you to try to put distance in between you, making your shots less reliable and making it easier for him to hit you. But as you can see, what this is going to do is if you push him out here, suddenly he's out of his IO's LOS, right? So any LOS healers are not going to be able to help him anymore. So by blinking yourself in a specific position around this Victor, you can improve your chances at winning this fight or just be more effective, right? Even if you don't get the kill, even if like IO starts shooting you or IO rotates maybe over here to get jumps over here to get positioning on the Victor and LOS on him, you can see that like you're being more effective just by choosing to blink in a slightly different position, right? If you blink here, instead of blinking like here, 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 or here, it's just going to be more effective at pushing out this Victor, right? And obviously that's like a super niche situation, but I just kind of wanted to show how at the super advanced level of play, like thinking about these like very small positioning things in terms of space and how the space is being used in sort of the space contestation battles and what people are going to do to respond to them can really help you improve your play in like these very small ways. Anyways, that's it for our first lecture on space, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you learned something from this or took away a lot from it. I really tried to make it really comprehensive, so hopefully even if you knew a lot about space already, you still learned something. Please comment any sort of changes on the format or anything you want to see going to the next lecture, as I haven't recorded them yet and I'm probably going to upload this before I do. Starting in lecture 3, by the way, we'll start looking at more like actual VODs. I know I didn't really have any VODs in this one, but I wanted to really make the example simple to understand, and didn't really want to comb through hours and hours of replays just to find easy to understand applications or examples of what I was trying to explain. So we'll get into VODs a little bit later. But yeah, so leave some feedback. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for making it to the end. And I'll see you in the next video where we go over resources.